So, in this podcast, we're going to talk about and learn about one of my favorite herbs of all time, and actually, probably the biggest herb on the planet. And why I say that, why I make that claim, is that this herb is the most scientifically researched of any herb ever known, ever studied, etc. On top of that, it's one of the most revered, if not the most revered, herb of all of ancient China. Now, of course, that herb is none other than reishi mushroom. And again, it's one of my favorite herbs, an herb that I've worked with quite a bit over the last 8 or so years. It's one herb that I've gotten a lot of really solid feedback about and heard just a lot of great success stories. So what we're going to do in this podcast is first go over some of the legend and the lore of reishi mushroom, then take a quick trip through the scientific research that's been done on reishi, and then I'm going to share with you actually a quick overview of some of the research that I personally had done. A good overview of the research that's actually out there. And what I discovered was pretty amazing and pretty unbelievable almost. And then after that, we're going to talk about how reishi works as an adaptogen. We're going to understand what an adaptogen is, how it can help us deal with stress, how stress can sort of beat down our immune system, and obviously why we need to keep that from happening. And then we're going to talk about one of the other things that makes reishi so famous and so powerful is that its effects on the immune system. Now, when it comes to the immune system and a lot of the other systems in the body, what makes reishi so powerful and so amazing is that it's what's considered to be dual directional. And they've basically figured out that reishi has 600 to 900 different chemicals. And from that, they've understood, at least scientifically, that reishi modulates about 300 or so different processes in the body, which that's a lot. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot going on, especially for just one herb. But specifically, what makes it so amazing is that in the context of the immune system, it's not an immune stimulant like a lot of herbs, and it's not an immune depressant like a lot of herbs and substances as well. What makes it unique and special is that it's an immune regulator or an immune modulator. So if we have a weakened immune condition, depressed immune condition, it can then bring that up and strengthen that part of our immune system. And if we have part of our immune system which is excessive, or we have allergies or autoimmune things, it can sort of calm that down and help to bring that back to balance. And that's really the overarching thing, is reishi helps to just balance the immune system and over time make the immune system stronger, more efficient, and more effective. So now that we've had just sort of a decent introduction, let's take a look at some of the history and lore for this herb and see how just revered it was and how special it was in ancient times. Now, the names by which reishi is known give an idea to a large degree about how the ancient Chinese and Japanese revered this herb. To the ancient Chinese, reishi was called lingqi, which means spirit plant. And the Chinese character for lingqi is actually composed of 3 characters, one for shaman, one for praying for, and one for rain. So just from those little examples right there, we can see just how spiritual and just revered this herb was. And reishi has also been called the 10,000-year mushroom and the mushroom of immortality because it's said to help promote longevity. And actually the word reishi, which is the name that we know it by here in the West, actually comes from the Japanese. So the Japanese word for reishi is actually reishi. And the Latin name is actually Ganoderma lucidum, and which basically means, Ganoderma essentially means shiny skin, and lucidum means brilliant. And if you've ever seen a reishi mushroom, you pretty much know what that means. And if you don't know what that means, just look up reishi on Google Images and you'll see exactly why it's called shiny skin and brilliant. So reishi has been essentially regarded as the king of herbal medicines, with many herbalists actually ranking it above ginseng. And personally, I fit into that category as well. And there was a professor called Hiroshi Hikino from the University of Tohoku in Japan, and he was essentially a premier authority on herbs and plants and medicinal substances, and he basically called reishi one of the most important elixirs in the Orient. So from those examples, we can get a pretty good idea about how revered reishi was. Also, Reishi was found ubiquitously throughout ancient Chinese culture in paintings and artwork, in woodwork, on clothing, in poetry, in mythology, and just quite ubiquitously throughout the ancient Chinese culture. And I've actually seen that reishi symbol, the reishi emblem, in Chinese movies or kung fu movies. And I actually, in one of my other courses called the Immortal Mushroom course, where I basically went super in depth on reishi, which you can actually find that course on this HyperionHerbs.com site as well. And if you want to just get the whole download on reishi, I highly recommend that. But the reason I bring it up is that contained within that course, there's a video tour of a lot of the different some artifacts which contain reishi, and then on top of that, there's actually a reishi museum in Taiwan. There's an official museum dedicated to this one herb. So just with all of that alone, I could wrap up this podcast, and just that would give you an idea about how revered and how special and magical this herb is. So the ancient Chinese text called the Shen Nang, which originates from a really, really long time ago, essentially 500 CE. Basically stated that reishi is useful for enhancing vital energy, increasing thinking faculty, and preventing forgetfulness. That it can refresh the body and mind, delay aging, and enable one to live a long life. And it's also said to stabilize one's mental condition. And that really ties into even the modern classification, the modern usage of it for, stabilizing the Shen or building the Shen, which is our sort of mental, emotional, and more spiritual aspects. So on the topic and on the subject of talking about Reishi's sort of spiritual aspects, we can really see and understand that it has a pretty colorful past. And according to legend, Taoist priests in the first century were actually the first people to really experiment and use this herb. And I've actually read some Taoist texts and seen in the glossary they mentioned reishi mushroom, which was pretty cool and pretty fun to see. And they're supposed to have included the mushroom in magic potions that would grant them longevity, eternal youth, immortality, etc. And these Taoist priests of the period practiced alchemy and were pretty well known for casting spells and mixing various concoctions. And they were looked upon as magicians or wizards. And well, in our kind of modern time, we probably wouldn't use such pleasant terminology for them, but in that time they were looked up to and regarded as magicians and wizards. But essentially, we have to remember that alchemy and what they were practicing was the forerunner of chemistry, and essentially these people were shamans who were treating the sick and treating people by summoning the forces of nature to essentially cure people and help people. Again, we can refer to another ancient Chinese text where reishi is highly regarded, and it's China's oldest materia medica called the Herbal Classic, and it is basically divided into 365 ingredients, and it basically ranks herbs into three different categories, meaning superior, and then sort of the medicinal, and sort of the inferior herbs. And this book regards reishi as a superior herb, which has a bitter taste and an atmospheric energy of being neutral and having no toxicity. The book says that it cures accumulation of pathogenic factors in the chest. It's good for the chi of the head, including mental activities. It tonifies the spleen, increasing wisdom, improving memory so that you won't forget. Long-term consumption will lighten the body and you will never become old. It lengthens years. It has spiritual power and develops spirit so that you become a spirit being like the immortals. And that's nothing I made up. That's a direct quote from the Herbal Classic, which is the oldest ancient Chinese text. So reishi's reputation as the mushroom of immortality essentially reached one of the oldest Chinese emperors, who was Emperor Ti. And this emperor is supposed to have set up a whole fleet of ships of 300 men and 300 women, and he told them to sail to the east where they thought reishi was growing, and then they were supposed to bring that back. So essentially, as the story goes, the ship essentially got lost at sea, and then they were shipwrecked and washed ashore in Japan, and according to this story, that's actually how Japan was started. So again, just to recap, according to this lore and mythology, Japan was discovered and colonized because the emperor sent 300 men and 300 women in a fleet of ships out to find reishi mushroom. So just that little anecdote alone is pretty crazy. So as I mentioned earlier, in Chinese art, reishi is pretty ubiquitous and pretty widespread as a symbol of good health and long life. We can find depictions and images of reishi found on doors, door lintels, archways, and railings throughout the Forbidden City and the Summer Palace in ancient China. And at various times in Chinese history, the emperor's official scepter included a carving of reishi mushroom, which the people actually believe, and they actually have pictures of the original scepter, and they think that it was actually a real reishi mushroom. So, to the general population, to the general public, the image of reishi appears to be more of a good luck charm or like a talisman or a symbol that's thought to have sort of magical powers. And then in various pen and ink drawings, tapestries, and paintings, subjects would sometimes wear jewelry or jade pieces made in the image of reishi mushroom. And Kuan Yin, who is the ancient Chinese goddess of healing and mercy, is sometimes depicted actually holding a reishi mushroom. So hopefully all those examples have given you a good idea, a good illustration and demonstration of how revered and how magical reishi was believed to be in ancient times. And again, if you want to go more in depth in that, check out the audio course that's on the site as well. You can go more full on into that. Now, next, what we're going to get into is some of the scientific research and scientific data that's been done on reishi in modern times. Now, at this point, we should probably pause and just at least ask ourselves, reishi was very obviously regarded pretty tremendously in ancient times. Reishi is the most well-studied herb on the planet. There must be something going on here. So, some of the things that reishi's been studied and been shown to be effective for are the following. Now, again, as a disclaimer, I'm obviously not making any claims. I'm not offering any medical advice. I'm simply sharing what is openly available on the internet through PubMed and Google Scholar and various other scholarly journals. I'm not claiming that reishi cures or prevents any of these things because I'm not a doctor and I'm not allowed to give medical advice. This is just me sharing information with you, which is pretty interesting and cool to me, and maybe it will be the same to you. So if you were to look on, say, Google Scholar or PubMed or any academic journal, you would see that reishi has been studied scientifically for things like skin cancer, for things like reducing the side effects of radiation, for things like tumors, for being a potent antioxidant, for being a remedy or something shown to be positive against infections, for being a potent anti-inflammatory, for being a tonic to the cardiovascular system, for helping to balance cholesterol, and for also helping to detox and protect the liver. Now again, none of those are claims. Those are just things that I came across through researching Google Scholar and PubMed and just generally researching reishi. Obviously, you can go look those things up yourself and check it out, but I just wanted to share those with you because essentially what I've just had done is because I've found all of these studies, I basically initiated a massive overview of all of the research that is out there on reishi. So I had I hired a researcher actually to comb through all of the databases and journals to dig up all of the studies about reishi and cancer, reishi and tumors, reishi and autoimmune diseases, reishi and allergies, reishi and inflammation, reishi and viruses and bacteria, reishi and diabetes, reishi and hepatitis. And many of the studies and many of the data that I was able to have compiled is pretty interesting and pretty profound. So slowly over time, I'll be probably posting that stuff online for other people to check out. Again, I'm not making any sort of claims or giving any sort of medical advice. Obviously, only your practitioner should do that. And I'm just sharing with you some things that I've seen and I've come across and things which are openly and publicly available through these various academic journals and academic resources. So far we've understood and seen the massive historical and mythological and ancient reverence for reishi as an herb. And we've seen some of the ways in which reishi has been studied, and we've seen and understood how reishi is the most scientifically studied and scientifically validated herb in the history of science and the history of herbalism and the history of modern culture in general. So now we're going to take a look at how reishi is an adaptogen and how it can really help us adapt to stress, help our immune system, and essentially aid in the attainment of good health and a long life. So first we should understand and know what is an adaptogen. An adaptogen is essentially a term or a classification of herbs which was invented in the 50s or 60s coming out of Russian research. Now essentially the Russians were looking for plants and substances and really anything they could do to get the leg up or to get an advantage on the rest of the world. So they discovered, things like ginseng and schizandra and reishi and Siberian ginseng, luthero and astragalus and many, many other herbs. They discovered that these herbs had an ability to help us adapt to stress and handle stress better. Whether that was the stress of daily living, the stress of high altitude, the stress of high performance, the stress of war, the stress of going into space, etc. And these are all the reasons why they wanted to find these substances, is because they wanted to be the best. They essentially wanted to take over the world, and they spent a lot of time and energy studying plants and substances which could assist them and help them in doing that. So the good news is, out of all of that research, we now know what an adaptogen is and we understand how it works. So essentially, again, an adaptogen is a substance or a plant which helps our body adapt to stress. And because it's an adaptogen, it also adapts to our metabolism. It adapts to our immune system, meaning if we take it in the morning, it'll sort of give us a little bit of energy. Or if we wake up and we're anxious, it'll sort of chill us out. And if we're going to go to bed at night and we're sort of feeling wired, it can sort of calm us down, relax us, and help us sleep. Which actually right now it's about 10 p.m. and I'm sipping a cup of gynostemma tea. Now if I were to drink this tea first thing in the morning, I'd probably feel relaxed and calm and slightly energized. But because it's later at night, it's already making me feel more relaxed, making me feel more focused and calm, and then essentially I'm going to be heading towards bed very, very soon. So a little bit more about how an adaptogen works. Essentially, when we stress, that kicks on our fight or flight response. And our fight or flight response is really a feedback loop between our adrenals, our hypothalamus, and our pituitary. So we get stressed, our adrenals do their thing and secrete their hormones, and there's this whole feedback loop which happens. So essentially what adaptogens do is number one, they improve our body's ability to handle stress and adapt to stress. So they make the effects of stress less damaging, less harmful on the body. Then over time, they make that feedback loop much shorter, while simultaneously increasing our ability to handle stress and increasing the stimulus that it would take or require for us to actually experience stress. And just as a personal example, personal story, you may have heard me talk about this before, you may not, so I'll share it with you now. But there was a time in my early 20s where anytime I would get stressed or anxious, I would just get this pain in my lower back and like this tingling sensation up my spine and in the back of my head, and I get sort of lightheaded and feel just pretty terrible, to put it lightly. Little did I know and little did I understand at that time that was actually stress. That was my body leaking adrenaline. That was my body going into fight or flight. So what I learned and how I understood that is over time I started taking reishi, I started taking cordyceps, started taking astragalus, and I realized, whoa, that's not really happening as much. That's not really happening as often. I'm able to do more. I'm actually able to go out and do more and be more and have more and handle more because my nerves are getting stronger. That feedback loop is getting stronger and it's getting more efficient and more effective. And then now I honestly cannot tell you the last time I actually felt that sensation because through taking the adaptogens and also, diet and exercise and these other things, I've just gotten to a place where that stress doesn't affect me in the same way. Now, obviously, we're all human. We all experience stress. We all experience stress all the time. It's just a matter of how we handle it and how we're able to handle it and deal with it. Because the idea is not to eliminate stress altogether and just sit quietly in a room in the dark and never do anything, because that's really out of balance. That really has nothing to do with life. We should always be growing and expanding and feeling healthy and feeling vital and being, slightly challenging ourselves all the time. So we're always moving and growing and becoming more of who we really are. Now, there's actually been a lot of research done on the effects of stress on the body. And there's one researcher who's from Stanford, who's sort of an integrated medicine expert, and he's essentially concluded that at least in America, between 80 to 90% of all illnesses are linked to stress, and 75 to 90% of all visits to the doctor are for stress or anxiety related conditions. And it's really not that hard to fathom, not that hard to understand when you look at our modern world and how sort of overwhelmed and bombarded we are with stimuli and information all the time. From cell phones, text messages, voicemails, phone calls, missed calls, emails, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Tumblr, stumble upon Google. On top of that, our jobs, all our relationship, our kids, our grandkids, our significant other, our husbands, our wives, etc. We have all these demands placed on us all the time. Not to mention just living our lives, waking up, eating breakfast, brushing our teeth, exercising, living, achieving our goals, etc. We have all these demands, all these things coming at us all the time. So it's no wonder that there's so much stress and there's so much stress rampant throughout our society. Because as of yet, we haven't really learned and adapted ways of actually adapting and handling stress. Meaning our stressors and the available amount of information and data to sort through and process has exponentially increased, while our ability to actually handle it and deal with it and sort with it and digest it and process it and utilize it and embody it has hardly increased at all. It's basically increased, a couple little baby steps disproportionately to the exponential increase of the other side of it, which is what's actually expected of us. So for that reason, that's why I'm a huge fan of herbs like adaptogens and reishi and cordyceps and astragalus and polyrachis ant and gynostemma and many other herbs, and a huge fan of things like tai chi and qigong and bagua and yoga and meditation and breathing and all these things because they help us train our body and help us handle stress much more easily, effectively, and efficiently. And it's also really important because stress plays a huge role as it relates to our immune system. Now, one of the major effects of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol is they temporarily suppress parts of our immune system. So the effect is so powerful that adrenaline is actually used in emergencies to treat patients who are having a life-threatening allergic reaction to, say, nuts or peanuts or something like that, which is basically the result of your immune system going into overdrive against a foreign substance that the body sees as sort of evil or bad it needs to get rid of. So chronically elevated levels of adrenaline and cortisol can pretty easily have a negative effect on one's immune system. And if your immune system's constantly suppressed because you're constantly stressed out, that's going to add up. That's just going to create a breeding ground for less than ideal health conditions. And if our goal is real health and transformation and longevity, we need to plug that up. We need to nip that in the bud as soon as possible because that's a huge leak of energy. It's a huge waste of energy that could be used for other things. On top of that, it makes us susceptible to getting infections, to getting colds, to getting these minor little things, which then impede us and really hinder us from living our lives and expressing ourselves in the way that we want to. So long story short, chronic stress and chronic inability to actually handle stress is just constantly chipping away at our foundation and undermining our overall homeostasis and balance. So now that we've been talking about the immune system and how stress can affect it, let's talk a little bit more about how reishi can positively affect and influence the immune system. So reishi is unique in that it's very rich and concentrated in chemicals that are considered to be long-chain sugars or polysaccharides. Reishi also has a whole wide array of triterpenoids and a whole wide array of different fatty acids and oils which give it its amazing properties. And because reishi is so complex, because it has so many active constituents, for that reason, that's why I tend to go for a full plant concentrated extract. So all of the herbs that you'll see on the site are 10-to-1 extract, meaning it takes 10 pounds of whole herb that's concentrated into 1 pound of extract. Whereas there are some herbal products on the market which are extracts but 1% of this chemical or 10% polysaccharides, 2% triterpenes, etc. And sure, those can be fine for specific situations, but when you're dealing with herbs that are so chemically complex, you really want the full spectrum, especially if you're going to be using it as a daily tonic. And if something has, 600 to 900 active constituents, we don't really know A plus B equals C. Sure, we can identify little bits and pieces and say, oh, well, these chemicals do this, these ganoderic acids do that. Cool. But really, when something is so complex, we can't really isolate it and say, oh, if like for example, we could say reishi has polysaccharides. These polysaccharides are immune modulatory and really balancing to the immune system. So we might think, oh, well, we should get a reishi extract with 80% polysaccharides because that would just be way better, right? Wrong. That's not really what we're after. Obviously, if you had a life-threatening condition, you need a really extreme medicine, that might be an appropriate thing. Which, if you think about it, that's essentially what pharmaceutical medicine is they isolate one chemical and they super hyper concentrate it. And then as a result, there's many side effects that come along with that because they've sort of eliminated the natural and inherent intelligence of the plant. So for that reason, reishi is preferably for me in a full plant spectrum concentrated extract that's been, extracted both with hot water and alcohol to pull out both the water soluble constituents and the oil soluble constituents. So that was just an important sort of side note and detour that I wanted to take and just make a couple of those important points. So as I mentioned before, reishi is an immune modulator, immune tonic, because it has these polysaccharides, these beta glucans, as well as many other chemicals that are contained within it. So basically what these things can do is when we take them into our body, they sort of plug in like lock and key on various receptor sites in our immune system. And then they basically say, hey, immune system, you got something going on over here, you need to go check that out. Or they say, hey, all of you immune cells are just sitting there doing nothing. You need to get up and get to work and get some action. So then boom, it helps to ramp up that underactive part. But then there's a part over here that says, hey, you're really overactive, you're sort of overdoing it over here. Just calm down a little bit, just bring it down and maybe come focus over here. So essentially what that means is these unique chemicals can plug into receptor sites on our immune system and help the immune system function more effectively and efficiently and essentially more intelligently. So it helps the immune system do what it does a lot better. And for me in my own life, I've seen some pretty amazing effects from working with the immune system using these herbs. From working with people, friends and family, I've seen some pretty amazing things as well. And obviously, I'm not making any claims. I'm just, relaying things that I've seen in my own life. And essentially, I'm at this point in my life where it's almost not even a possibility to get sick or catch a cold or do anything like that. And you might think, oh, that sounds weird, or I thought you're supposed to get sick, or I thought it's okay. If that's what you want, if that's what you're into, that's fine. But for me, I'm not really into that. So I've just worked in set up a lifestyle and set up a sort of a habits which facilitate that and necessitate that as a real possibility. So for me, it's definitely possible that we could all get to a point where we could never be sick again. Now, I'm not claiming that if you just take reishi mushroom, you'll never be sick again for your entire life, because I'm not the universe, I'm not the cosmos, I'm not you. I don't know. I can't make those claims. What I can say is that taking immune modulating herbs can have a definite balancing and strengthening effect for the immune system. And that if you couple that with, eating well and exercising and drinking good water and breathing and minimizing stress and meditating and doing, all these other common sense things which I've talked about in other podcasts, other videos, then you have a really nice program, a really nice lifestyle set up. So for me, reishi is one of the best herbs for the immune system, and because it contains these polysaccharides. Now also cordyceps contains that, as well as astragalus. Those are immune modulating as well. Now there's a few other herbs that are modulating to the immune system, but in a different way. The first one would be polyrachis ant. That's also an immune modulator and very good for the immune system because it actually helps with the growth and the maintenance of the thymus gland, which is a gland that seems to sort of shrivel up and wither away as we age, and it's a really crucial and important part of our immune system. So the second herb will be gynostemma. Gynostemma is honestly, speaking of, I need to take a drink now. Gynostemma is probably one of the best adaptogens on the planet, and it has 82 to 88 to 100 different adaptogenic saponins. Depending on who you talk to or what research you read, there's various numbers. But essentially, it is also an immune tonic, an immune modulating thing, but in a slightly different way because it has slightly different personality, slightly different chemical makeup. So you can see that if you add in, a wide variety of immune herbs, immune tonics, and cycle them through over time and just experiment and, change it up, you have a pretty awesome lineup because each of these different things sort of hit things at a different angle and modulate things at a different angle. And the immune system is really critical and crucial and important for a lot of reasons. One of them is that, number one, we're facing, lots of viruses and bacteria and mold and yeast, etc., all the time. Especially if we're working in public or working in a building with lots of other people, especially if they're just sort of mainstream people who don't, know anything or do anything about health. So people are going to be carrying around some germs. I mean, we all do. It's just part of being human. And even if we, go out and use a public restroom, boom, there's lots of germs there. On top of that, there's all of the environmental pollution, which is coming at us all the time, in the form of, estrogens, xenoestrogens, plastics, oils, car exhaust, anti-flame retardants, etc. Just all the time, these things are coming at us, bombarding our immune system. And we need to have, something which can help us deal with that and mitigate that and sort of not be succumbing to that stress, because all of those things are stressors. All those things, visible and invisible, are stressors. Things like being around a lot of EMF pollution, that's also a stressor to the nervous system, to the immune system, to the whole body. So for that reason, having adaptogens, having immune tonics in the play is pretty essential and pretty critical. And again, this is basing off of and really keying into a lot of the research that the Russians pioneered back in the 50s and 60s, where they were trying to look for substances that would allow them to adapt to stress and essentially have a competitive edge over the rest of the planet so that they could then hopefully take over the world, which was, obviously their plan. So for me, for all those reasons, adaptogens and immune tonics are great tools, great allies that we have. And of course, since reishi is the most scientifically studied, scientifically validated herb, and number two, the most historically revered herb of all time, that makes a pretty darn good case, and for those reasons, it's one of my favorite herbs. And it was one of my favorite herbs before I even knew those things, so when I discovered them, and thus now I'm sharing with you, it's like even cooler. So hopefully this podcast has been interesting and entertaining, and you've learned some new things about this herb. There's plenty more that I could go into, but we're coming up on about 34 minutes here, and I don't want this to be a 12-hour reishi podcast. I just wanted to give sort of a good overview of reishi, a good broad perspective on some of the amazing things that reishi can do. And again, remember, herbs don't work unless you actually take them. Meaning, unless you put them in your mouth and swallow them and digest them, they're not going to help us. So for me, I'm going to drink my gynostemma tea now and relax and get ready for bed. And if you have any questions or comments, either post them below or send me an email, and I will talk to you soon.